Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Octopus 101 webinar. My name is John Bristowe. I'm a member of the team here at Octopus Deploy. Thank you for your time and attention joining us here today for today's webinar. Octopus 101 is a webinar series we've been running for a while, and it's designed basically to provide you an introduction to Octopus Deploy and how Octopus works. So in this webinar, we're going to take a look at all sorts of things related to, obviously, Octopus, but we're going to talk about how you can use Octopus to do robust and scalable deployments. And so if you've never seen Octopus Deploy before, if you've never used Octopus before, that's fine. In this webinar, we're going to show you all the ins and outs of how it works, what it does, and most importantly, why you should consider using it. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to remind folks that this is a live webinar, which means that you can ask your questions. So wherever you're joining us from here today, whatever social media platform you're joining us from today, please feel free to use the comment section to ask your questions. I'll be monitoring them here and answering them as we go through this content. So as I said before, this is meant to be an introduction, so we're going to go slow, but we're going to do lots and lots of demos. So I have very few slides, and I have mostly demos. So hopefully that works out for everyone. Again, my goal here is to basically give you an introduction to Octopus, show you how it works, and then talk a little bit about some of the specific scenarios you may encounter based on your questions. All right, so before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I just want to switch over here to our YouTube page. So if you miss anything throughout today's webinar, don't worry. Everything is going to be recorded and will be available as recording on our YouTube channel. So you can go to /Octopus Deploy. This is our YouTube channel. As the kids say, like and subscribe. So feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We publish videos there all the time. We recently hosted our 2025.2 release party, which gives you an introduction to all the new features we added in our latest release. We also have videos featuring folks like Matt, who talks about specific features. We have a conversation called our continuous delivery office hours. We also have a show called Deploy on Friday, which we also host. So these and other sorts of videos, you'll find anything and everything you need to know about Octopus, continuous delivery, platform engineering, DevX, etc. is available there. So feel free to check that out. Also, feel free to check out our upcoming webinars, which you'll find at octopus.com/webinars. And there you'll find an upcoming one, which we'll be hosting next week. This one's going to be featuring Matt Casperson talking about Octopus AI Assistants, and a new feature we have available for you to basically utilize AI in the context of Octopus. I might actually show a little bit of a demo of that today if you guys are all keen. But that will be next week, July 17th. So make sure to check that out. And finally, if you're all curious, you can check out octopus.com, which is obviously the homepage for this product. You can sign up for a free trial there. We also have a cloud version, which you can check out. Awesome. All right. So let's get back into the slides and provide some context here. So if you need to reach me, you can reach me at this email address. I'm happy to have a chat with you anytime. That's fine. So in this webinar, here are some of the things that we're going to be addressing. So we're going to talk about a bunch of things, but more specifically, we're going to talk about how Octopus works and why you should consider using it. Then we'll talk a little bit about some fundamental concepts. So I'm going to give you some terms to describe how Octopus works in the context of things like projects, deployment processes. We'll talk about things like releases, etc. So these and other sorts of terms we'll describe in the context of Octopus to help describe what we do in terms of a deployment. And we'll also use it in the context of automations as well. Octopus is a great automation workflow platform that you can use for your IT operations. And it's a feature we have called Runbooks, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll then talk about how to create a deployment process from scratch, and we'll also show you some existing deployment processes to give you a sense of what it's like to actually utilize these things. And then finally, we'll talk about how to actually trigger these workflows, these deployment processes through a CI process or server, which is basically how life starts for most software development. You typically start with a continuous integration process. Continuous integration, of course, is this mechanism that we employ as developers for continuously building, testing, etc., our code. And it's part of a workflow or a pipeline that we use in concert with other tools as well. And those tools can include Octopus. So to get our sort of lay our boundaries, or to get a sense of where we're at, let's imagine software development as it sits today. So on the left-hand side, we have our developers. On the right-hand side, we have our targets. Those targets can include things like Kubernetes. They can include things like AWS, etc. And somewhere in the middle, stuff happens. And so that stuff can include a CI process. It's basically building code, checking into repositories, running tests, etc. But then oftentimes, too often, the process of deployment is left unchecked. It's usually utilized as part of the CI process. You have these all-in-one solutions like GitHub, GitLab, etc., which basically give you mechanisms for doing deployments, but it's not as robust as something like, say, Octopus Deploy is. And so that's really what we're going to be addressing here today, is that final sort of last mile of the deployment pipeline. So we like to espouse that without Octopus Deploy, you have all these scripts. You have this sort of DIY setup where basically you have to write a lot of this stuff yourself. It can be very brittle. There's no notion of rollbacks. There's no notion of any deployment patterns. And with Octopus Deploy, what we provide you is a safe and sane way of doing deployments, utilizing patterns, utilizing all the greatness that we've built into that product with all the knowledge and experience we have. We have applications that are based on projects, for example. You can have variables that utilize those as part of a deployment process, which is great. And you can deploy this to a variety of targets. And it's very simple and easy to use. This is one of the diagrams we have on our homepage. Basically, it's the life before you have a deployment process in place. So the thing to just point out here is that center bit where the gray boxes are. These are your environments, your dev, test, prod, QA, etc. These are the environments that you'll typically deploy to. And you'll notice that there's a lot of traffic that's going around here. This is life before Octopus. And so you have a lot of stuff that happens because you have different constituents, you have different customers who need different versions of your product, you have different locations of where you want to push that product, that application. It could be into any number of targets. And so it becomes very, very challenging to do continuous delivery in such an environment. And so what we espouse is that with Octopus Deploy, you have a means of doing these deployments in a way that's repeatable, that's robust, etc. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here. And to put this in context for a scenario where you have something like GitHub, this is an example of where GitHub kind of might integrate within a scenario where you're utilizing Octopus. So at the top, we have scenarios where you're utilizing VS Code. We have integration there through GitHub Copilot. You may utilize GitHub for a repository mechanism, and for that, we have integration with GitHub Actions. We also have a GitHub app that you can use. You can also utilize this in concert with other scenarios as well. Like, for example, if you're utilizing container registries or artifact repositories, you can use that with something like JFrog, Artifactory, Docker Hub, etc. All these integrations are available there, and you can utilize these as part of a scenario. All right, so with that being said, let's get into a demo. As I said, I don't have a lot of slides. I just wanted to jump directly into a demo here and give you a sense of what Octopus looks like. So again, octopus.com, make sure to check it out. All right, so here is the dashboard for octopus.com, or Octopus rather, the instance that I have here available, which is for running Octopus. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen here so you can see this. In fact, let me get rid of myself. Awesome. All right, so what we have here is the dashboard for Octopus. On the left-hand side here, you can see I have a breakdown of various things. So I have, these are denoted by a category of function. So if I'm doing deployments, I can see it there. If I want to get insights into how my projects are doing, I can see that there. And then I have associated tasks also combined. In the middle here, in this section here in the middle, you'll see that I have a section that denotes all my projects. Now, projects are a container mechanism for things like variables, for your deployment processes, etc. And you'll notice that across the top here, I have a variety of environments. These environments here, things like development, staging, etc., production, these are available to me to deploy to. So at a glance, I get a really quick idea of what projects here on the left are deploying across what environments here on the top. And so the idea is that with the dashboard mechanism like this, you get an at a glance sense of where your projects are at in terms of their deployments and what state they're in. So to look at a different example, here's a different instance that I have. Here's an example of where I have multiple projects, multiple project groups, and I have various states across these environments for these different projects. So as you can see here, I have different states. So these states allow me to convey basically the state of my application. I can see what versions have gone into these environments. And if I need to, I can also deploy directly from this dashboard as well. Great. So Octopus Deploy provides this dashboard and gives you an at-a-glance sort of perspective of what this looks like. Let's drill into one of these projects here and see what's here. So I have an empty project here called products, and this can be named anything I want. It can be utilized in a number of ways. But in the middle here, it says here, create your deployment process. This is basically the core, the heart of the Octopus engine for doing deployments. So if we go ahead and click on create process, we're now taken to the process editor. And so the process editor is there for you to construct your deployment processes using building blocks that we call process templates or steps. So a process deployment, or a deployment process, is a collection of these steps that are built together to do a deployment. So as an example, looking at some of these, you can see I have some featured steps, things like deploy to a Helm chart, deploy to Kubernetes, for example, via YAML, run an AWS CLI script, run a script, which incidentally is our most popular step. This is sort of like, let me take the wheel and drive. It's our most popular step for doing these. A lot of people use these. We also have some more traditional ones like deploy to IS, deploy a package. A package is basically like a unit or file that we have for representing something. Like it could be like a zip archive, a tarball. It doesn't really matter, but a package contains other files. It can be typically an archive. And so these and other steps are available to me. Along the left-hand side, we have a number of categories that allow me to see these steps in different contexts. So if I'm mostly interested about Kubernetes, you can see the ones that we have there. If I'm utilizing Terraform, for example, we can do Terraform operations for apply, for example, so I can stand up infrastructure utilizing Terraform if I wanted to. We also have ones for cloud-native services like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, etc. Now, if it turns out that we don't have a step that you want to support, let's say that there's a specific step that you're interested in and you're keen on doing a deployment to, say, Tomcat or something like that, we also have this section here at the bottom, which is called Community Steps. And here you'll find over 560 steps that have been built by the community for various scenarios. So looking at this here, you can see we have various scenarios that have been outlined for different types of deployment steps. So if I wanted to, I could do an integration with Azure DevOps. Let's say I want to execute a build pipeline via the pipelines capability in Azure DevOps. I have a step that's been built by the community that I can utilize for that purpose, which is great. In addition to that, we have other ones as well. So you can see here we have one specific to GitHub, HashiCorp Vault, HipChat, if you're into that, Jenkins integration, Linux integration, Liquid-based for database management, etc. The list goes on and on and on. And so there's a whole slew of different types of community steps that you can use, these step templates that are available through the product if you're so inclined. But let's just go ahead and start by creating a deployment process from scratch. And we're going to utilize the ever popular run a script. So basically run a script, what this does is it basically allows you to run or execute a script as part of a step. Notice that when I select that option here on the left-hand side here, I have this in this well area here, I have a run a script option that's been specified. So I'm constructing my workflow, which is my deployment process, step by step. And this is the first execution. This is the first step in my workflow called run a script. Now, when I create a deployment process and I start adding steps to that process, you'll notice that there's lots and lots of options. Don't be too worried or too concerned about all the knobs and buttons that you see here. Each and every step is different, and they have different configuration options. The ones that are consistently across are these ones you see at the top. So you'll typically see in each step things like, what are the targets? Where do you want to run this step? What is the name of the step itself? And then there can be also a set of conditions associated with those steps. So things like what environments you want to run this against, how many retries you want to attempt, is there a timeout associated with this? Things like this are important because you have to remember when you're doing a deployment, it can be across various remote locations. So you have things like network latency to contend with. You may have different permission sets. You may also have sometimes just flaky services that require long time or retries to execute. And so these parameters you can specify on individual steps and allow you to control how those steps run in the context of a deployment process. Inside my run a script step here, you'll notice that I have an option here to specify where the script is coming from. So I can specify whether the script is defined inline, inside here of Octopus, whether it's coming from a Git repository, or whether the script is actually found in a package. So the package itself can be a zip archive, it can be a tarball, it can be whatever I'd like that we support. And I can then point to that and say, somewhere in that archive is a script file that I want to use in context of this deployment process. Go into that package, please, Octopus, and grab that script file and utilize that in this step. So these and other options I can specify. For the inline script, you can see here I can just simply specify a number of different options. So I can specify whether I want to execute it as PowerShell, Bash, whatever, C#, Python, it really doesn't matter. We have a number of options. A powerful option that we have when scripting these things, of course, is support for variables. So we have a mustache notation that denotes variables that you can use in the context of your scripts. Now, you may look at this and say, so what? This is a really powerful mechanism to Octopus itself. The ability to define variables, not only for projects, but ones that are cross-cutting projects. So variables are a mechanism that allow you to define things like what is the Octopus account name? Or if we scroll down, you can see there are a ton of variables provided as part of the system. If I want to get meta variables around the deployment itself, I can get those as well. These are different options I can define, and then you reference those in scripts. And the reason why that's powerful is because obviously it makes your scripts more robust as they move from environment to environment, for example. So you can denote those in line if you so wish. Now, I can simply just go ahead and start typing here for a script execution. So I can say write host, for example, hello world, or hello Octopus, for example. This is equivalent print line, for example, and then execute those. So the way that this is basically how we construct these deployment processes. We just create or construct a set of steps one after another. Let's take a look at a different example, a little bit more elaborate here. We'll take a look at a different instance here where I have a different process defined, and let's take a look at how this might be defined. So inside of this process, you can see I have a series of steps. Now it's not just one step, but it's a series of steps that will execute in sequential order. You can have these run in parallel, or you can have these run dependent upon each other. So remember that list of step conditions I showed you earlier? Inside those conditions, you had things like timeouts, etc. You can also have conditions on whether or not this step will run based on a previous step. So you can have these like child options. So you have this like branching mechanism within deployments, if you wish. So inside of this deployment process here, we're utilizing the integration with Slack. So first and foremost, I'm notifying some stakeholders saying, hey, a deployment's going to execute, and just let you know. From there, we have what's called a manual intervention step. A manual intervention step is basically a step that says, please go grab someone, a human, to go approve this step. And this is sort of like a gate, if you will. So it allows you to hold a deployment until someone comes along with the correct permissions or rights to approve this deployment going forward. That's what we call a manual intervention. If it is approved, then from there, we simply do the following. So first and foremost, we do an integration with SQL. So we check to see whether a database is present or whether it's present that we can deploy to. We then run a script that allows me to do a deployment to a database. And then from there, we do a bunch of options for remote services. So here we're executing steps for doing 3 different instances of an application. So the product service, the web, and the shopping cart itself. So the application here is actually composed of 3 different services that I can use in concert for this deployment. And then finally, and probably most important, is that we have an execution of a script that allows me to do some smoke test. So a smoke test here allows me to denote whether or not APIs are running, and that allows me to tell whether or not actually, if I call an API endpoint, that the service is up and running and the deployment has succeeded successfully. I could also round this out with other options as well, but that's essentially how this works. We have these options. Now, let's jump back to a simple example here. I'm just going to forget about running this here, but let's take a look at actually what happens when we run a deployment. We call this a release. So a release in Octopus is a term that we use to describe all the stuff that went into defining not only the deployment, but also the environments it's going to, all the packages associated with that, the variables that are associated with that, and we create what's called a snapshot. A snapshot or release, these are synonymous terms in the case of Octopus Deploy. It's basically a way of actually doing a deployment itself. And the way that we define this is when we go to do a deployment, let's say, for example, I want to deploy version 009 here to development. I'm going to create what's called a release. And you'll notice inside here, this release itself is based on a snapshot. The snapshot itself I've already created. But if I wanted to, I could go ahead and choose to deploy this. Now, we give you a bunch of options for doing the release itself. You notice we have the ability to say whether or not we want the deployment to occur now or later. So I can schedule this if I so wish. I can also denote whether I want to exclude certain steps. So in that list of options here at the bottom, you can see I can say whether or not I want a step to occur or not. And you'll notice here, this one is marked as required because you need at least one step to execute a deployment step. I only have one in my list here. If I went over to this example here, and for example, went over here and created a release, I could go ahead and create a release here as part of this execution, do a deployment, and I would see a list of options here available to me as well. This is what a release looks like from the concept of Octopus. So inside here, we have a number of environments. These are collectively defined as part of what are called a life cycle, which is a pattern that you apply to different environments. We're getting a little bit into the weeds here. I understand that for some folks, it may be a little bit, there's a lot of terminology that's being introduced here. Don't worry. The concepts are pretty familiar that you would use today for a general environment. It's just a named collection of physical servers you may be deploying to, or virtual in that case. It has integration with what we call build information for release notes, and then a set of packages, which are essentially the building blocks of your application. These are your zip archives, your tarballs, your exes, your DLLs, whatever it may be. There are a bunch of options here as to note as part of a release. But jumping back here, when I go and do deployment, I can schedule when they occur, what steps will be excluded. I can define what's called failure mode. Guided failure mode allows you to basically do some debugging, in a sense, when a deployment may fail. Deployments fail. Sometimes it's fine. And there's mechanisms built in Octopus to do rollbacks. You can also implement deployment patterns, blue, green, for example, etc. And if you want to debug these mechanisms, guided failure, as it reads here, is an error is encountered during the deployment. Octopus will pause and allow you to correct the error before proceeding. So it's a mechanism of kind of debugging what happened when your deployment actually failed. There's other options I can specify as well, but if I so wish, I can just simply click on deploy. And when that does that deployment, it then adds it to our deployment queue. So here we're executing a very simple process. The reason why I want to do a simple process here is because sometimes deployments take a while, and we shouldn't just sit here watching this. So this is the simplest example you can come up with. It only takes a few seconds to run. Here it's just warming up a cloud instance. It's talking to an agent, which we call Tentacle, and then doing a deployment of that script on that agent. And notice here across the top, we have a summary essentially of everything that's happening with this release. So I have a task summary, I have a task log, which I can drill into. I can take a look at history. I can take a look at changes. There are no changes yet. But these are really important things to point out because this gives you essentially an audit trail of what occurred from your deployment's perspective. So you can ask a question, who did what and when, and what actually changed as part of those processes. So it's a really powerful mechanism built into Octopus itself that allows you to get a sense of what occurred and why. And all of this is rolled up into that dashboard I showed you earlier here. So this dashboard now reflects the fact that I have 009 available in development. And if I wanted to, I could take a look at that later on. I get the same summary that I showed you earlier. Allows me to take a look at the task log, the history, the changes, etc. So this mechanism of seeing these things in the context of Octopus turns out to be pretty powerful because I want to be able to answer those questions if I'm doing an audit. So these are all the log entries available on that remote worker that did the execution. This is a very simple demo of the execution of a deployment itself, but this is what it looks like when you do them. Obviously, if you have more complicated or more complex deployment processes like this one, for example, it may take a little bit longer to execute, but rest assured that all those things are tracked and processed as part of the deployment dashboard. So if I take a look at the execution here that occurred a while back, you can see I see that same log. I can see all the tests that occurred as part of this. I can also see, if I wanted to, I can drill into a verbose listing of everything that occurred, and I can drill down into each one of these steps. If I have a step that fails, for example, I can drill into that and get a diagnosis of what occurred as part of that deployment process. All of that is built and maintained as part of Octopus. Another mechanism you can do, obviously, is if a deployment fails, for example, I can do a rollback very easily as it's built out of the box as part of Octopus itself. I'm not going to touch this instance here because it's a live instance, but you get the idea is that I can actually just walk up to these and simply control them as part of this deployment process. All right, so jumping back, just sharing with you just kind of the summary of what we talked about here. Octopus Deploy is basically a mechanism of doing deployments in a robust manner. You define these as part of a deployment process. We have a set of steps that you can use to define these things. A deployment process is a collection of steps, and you have mechanisms of controlling how those deployment processes occur. We have conditions, as I showed you earlier. We have the notion of deploying to different environments, etc. So there's lots of stuff that I've exposed you to. Hopefully this all makes sense. I realize in a 101 you're trying to just expose people to the starting point of this, but that's essentially what we're looking at here. All right. So just to kind of recap some of the things that we saw in the demo, I'm going to show you another demo in just a sec, so don't worry, we're going to take a look at some other things as well. But just to recap some of the things that I highlighted here. So as part of the deployment process, you get this visual representation of what a deployment looks like. This includes all your conditions, and you have the mechanism here of including things like parallel steps or child steps if you wanted. So you can do parallel execution of steps. We have integrated markdown-based notes. That's really helpful because obviously Octopus may be used more than one team, and you have to describe these things across teams. We have parallel step execution, as I mentioned earlier. It's denoted by this little symbol we have on the, you may not be able to see that, but there's a little symbol on here that denotes that it's running in parallel. We also have environment labels. So a really powerful mechanism of Octopus Deploy is the ability to control what steps work on what environments. So oftentimes you might be in a situation where you have more than one environment. You want your deployment process to be flexible based on those deployments. So what I mean by that is rather than having to script all the different permutations of environments directly in your scripts for a deployment. Like let's say I have dev, test, and prod, and then I have a script that does a deployment. I only want that script to work in dev and test and not in prod. Very common scenario. Or the opposite, I only want this step to run inside of prod. You can do that. You can actually say which steps work in which environments, which is really powerful. So what that means is you have control outside the context of the deployment process for denoting which steps run in which environments, which is great. So this is better than the alternative, which is typically you have to script this and then execute it based on a parameter list. All right, so talking a little bit more about the values of Octopus going forward. So there's lots of, obviously, areas that Octopus shines. The first and foremost, obviously, is being able to support reliable and risk-free deployments. This is built out of the box, and this is something that we, obviously, this is our bread and butter. We have built-in rollback support, as I mentioned before. You can implement deployment patterns, and you have this safe and sane way of doing deployments across your environments so that you can deploy on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It doesn't matter. You should be able to deploy any day of the week with Octopus. In addition to that, we also have a built-in capability called runbooks. This is something I mentioned earlier, but runbooks is basically this facility that allows you to pair up your IT operations with your deployments. And this is often a scenario that's often forgot about with other solutions. So oftentimes you want to do IT operations like implement a server update or a database roll-up, etc., or you may want to restart a website, for example. These and other privileged operations you typically have in some form of a script, but you can pair these up with Octopus and define them in Octopus with all the appropriate permissions. And these are what a facility we have built into Octopus called runbooks. So runbooks gives you this mechanism for pairing up those release management sort of operations you have to do typically in the context of a deployment. If you're working with Kubernetes, for example, we have built-in support for this. This is something that we tout quite a bit. We have built-in support for YAML, Helm, etc. We have a facility called Kubernetes Live Object Status, which I'll show you in a sec, which allows you to see the live statuses of your resources based on Kubernetes. So you can see your pods, etc. You can drill down into the log files that are associated with your deployments there, as another example. Another facility we have built in Octopus is a feature called tenants or multi-tenancy. This idea that my application may operate and may work differently depending upon where it's deployed to. And I want to quantify those things as tenants. This is a feature that a lot of our Octopus customers love, especially when they become more experienced and more mature in their use of Octopus Deploy. Multi-tenancy is like the #1 feature that they often cite, that they absolutely love. So the idea is I can define a bunch of tenants as part of an instance, and I can basically do different deployments to those tenants. A common scenario may be if I'm running in this graphic here. A common scenario might be something like, let's say I'm running a series of clinics for veterinary clinics across, say, the US, and I have some in the Eastern US and Western US. I may want to actually have different versions of my applications deployed to those different types of tenants. So these capabilities turn out to be pretty powerful as part of a deployment scenario. Another thing that we also have support for is obviously the built-in support for governance, risk, and compliance. And so, as I showed you earlier, there's a full audit trail for every operation that is conducted by Octopus. But in addition to that, oftentimes there's integrations that you want to utilize in concert with the deployment process. So a common scenario might be I'm utilizing a product like ServiceNow or Jira Service Desk, for example, and that serves as the controller for when a deployment occurs. We may want to control basically when a deployment occurs based on an approval. So I may have to wait for an approval based on a ServiceNow mechanism. We have integration with all these platforms that allow you to control Octopus execution in that context. But if there's one that we don't support, we have a CLI that you can use, and you can integrate your automation scripts with that, no problem. You can definitely control how that works. All right, less slides, more demos. Let's take a look at another example here. So an often common scenario is, or a question that often comes up, okay, I get it. There's the deployment scripts. I understand that you're doing deployments, but I'm in an automation context. Where's the automation? How am I doing automation in the context of Octopus? So we have integrations that, sorry for the context change there. I realize it's a bit of a dark to light mode switch there. But we have a variety of scenarios that we support out of the box for different types of customers. So whether you're using GitHub, GitLab, Circle CI, TeamCity, Azure DevOps, etc., all these different CI processes we integrate with. And so to show you an example here, I have a GitHub repo here. You can see I've executed a bunch of GitHub actions here denoted by these workflows. If I jump to the location of where this GitHub action is defined, it's defined in this well-known location, this .github/workflows location. And inside here are my YAML files for defining my builds. You can see here's a typical build file. If you haven't seen YAML before, don't worry. It's nothing special. It's just indentated. But you can see here I have a workflow defined as part of GitHub Actions. And down here, we have the ability of integrating with Octopus. So we have a number of GitHub Actions that we have built out of the box with GitHub. These are available in the marketplace that you can utilize to do things like creating a package and making it available. I'll talk about packages in a sec. And I can upload those packages to Octopus via the push package action. So packages, as I said before, are those mechanisms for basically containers for your application, your zip archives, etc. And you can push those to a package repository we have built into Octopus. If I wanted to, I could also push build information. This is the information associated with how Octopus itself, how your build was created. These are really useful in the case of release notes. And then if I wanted to, I could start creating releases. So these are the sort of operations I can execute in the context of GitHub, which is great. Taking a look at the GitHub the GitHub marketplace here, you'll notice that if you search here for Octopus inside the marketplace, you'll find a bunch of the actions available there. You can utilize these in concert with Octopus. That integration also exists for other scenarios as well. Say, for example, TeamCity. This is the #1 integration on the JetBrains marketplace for TeamCity. This is the Octopus deploy integration. This is how you integrate it with integration into TeamCity is pretty trivial, actually. That also applies to Azure DevOps as well. So if you want to utilize integration with Octopus via pipelines, you can do so. I'm showing the old UI here. This is outside the context of YAML, but you're using it looks almost identical in the context of YAML here, but you can see we have an integration here for Azure DevOps with Octopus as well. So those are integrations that we support out of the box. And of course, those execution contexts that I showed you earlier here in the case of actions, those are utilizing those integrations here for Octopus deploy as well. So as you're utilizing these actions, you'll see a number of different ways in which those things actually propagate. We don't have any recent workflows, obviously, here of the run, but this is how it would show up in the context of Octopus itself. Awesome. So one of the other features I wanted to highlight here is Kubernetes Live Object Status. So this is a scenario where I have a different instance that I'm targeting Kubernetes with. You'll notice here we have an option here for basically specifying whether or not we want to turn on or off this feature called Live Status. You notice that when I turn this off, you may not have noticed this. I'll kind of do this again. So here I'm showing my deployments. If I turn on Live Object Status, you'll notice that these icons and their states change. So what I'm seeing here is the reflection of what we know about the Kubernetes instance that we're deploying to, its state, and anything associated with it in terms of the logs itself. So if we drill into one of these, for example, I can take a look at the state of this deployment, utilizing Live Object Status, and get a sense of what the health of the pods, the services, the ingress control, etc. All these are listed as healthy. But if I had an error here, for example, I could actually utilize this to help me debug the state of those deployments in concert with Kubernetes. And so being able to drill down into one of these, for example, if I'm taking a look here at a service, and I can take a look at the various endpoints, we get a detailed rundown of the summary and the events that are associated with this. Obviously, this one's not stated, but I can take a look at the manifest here. The reason why this event log here is blank is because we've turned off the deployment target in this case here, but we still have a record of all the things that occurred. This occurred a couple of days ago, obviously. But if I wanted to, I could take a look at those if it was live, and I could see the state of those occurring as part of this. Great. So Kubernetes Live Object Status, etc. These are all features that are available as part of our roadmap. You can find this over at roadmap.octopus.com. You can see some of the latest features we've added here to Octopus Cloud. We have two versions of Octopus that run. We have one that's in the cloud, so you can have a hosted instance. We also have a on-prem or self-hosted instance that you can run as well. So you can see all the features here available on our roadmap if you're so inclined. Awesome. All right. So that is a very, very brief but detailed rundown of all the features that we have inside of Octopus Deploy itself. Again, this is the 101, so it's basically geared towards helping you understand what Octopus looks like from a high level. Hopefully, you've learned everything you need to know from a Octopus standpoint to get you interested in downloading a trial. You can download a free trial today at octopus.com. So in this webinar, here's what we learned. We talked a little bit about how Octopus works and why you should use it. Most importantly, the why. Understanding the how is important, but the why is probably the most important. You want to have safe and sane deployments. You want to be able to define these deployments in the context of a system that allows you to control them. You want to use those in concert with an existing pipeline, which we have integration for. You want to be able to utilize concepts or fundamental concepts like projects, deployment processes, releases, etc. You want to have the ability to view these things easily via a dashboard and get a sense of where your deployments sit. And probably the most important reason why you want to use a tool like Octopus is because you should be able to deploy on Friday. This mechanism of deploying on Friday is the result of bad deployment scripts or bad processes. And too oftentimes it's because you haven't taken the time to implement these in a careful way. And so utilizing a tool like Octopus allows you to do it on Saturday, on Sunday, deploy any day of the week. You should be able to. And so if you want to do continuous delivery, you need to utilize a facility like this. I then showed you how to create a deployment process from scratch using steps. We took a look at some more complicated deployment processes as well. We saw integration with Slack, for example. And then finally, how to trigger these deployments via other mechanisms. I showed you GitHub Actions, but there's a ton of integration points that we have with other solutions like Azure DevOps, TeamCity, etc. Awesome. All right. So with that wraps up today's webinar. I'm just going to check to see if there are any questions or comments in the queue. There are none. That's great. Either everything was crystal clear or nothing was crystal clear, but whatever, that's fine. If you need to reach me, you can reach me at this email address here. Otherwise, you can check out our YouTube channel, as I mentioned before. And then finally, don't forget, octopus.com to download your free trial, to install it yourself, or to obviously utilize it in the context of Octopus Cloud. This is just me tap dancing, waiting for questions if there are any. I'm not seeing any questions here. That's great. Anyways, so with that being said, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you for joining us for our webinars. We run these monthly all the time, and gives you essentially an exposure to Octopus itself. We have other webinars coming up. As I mentioned before, we have our AI webinar coming up next week, so stay tuned for that. But until next time, thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. And from all of us to all of you, happy deployments, everyone. Take